Thank you for tuning in to the World Builder's Anvil, episode 144, The Ripples of Tragedy.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm Michael Miller.
And here today, we are going to talk about tragedy. But just up front, I want to be clear. We're not trying to talk about the emotional impact of any certain stories.
We will a little.
Well, maybe
though.
the emotional impact, but
yeah, that is an important aspect.
We're focused on the effects of tragedies on cultures, not so much on what happened, what you should or should not think about things afterwards, just about tragedies that we're going to talk about and some of the possible effects that either did happen or we could see happening through that type of culture or that type of tragedy, which some cultures are maybe tragic. I don't know.
If you listened to the last episode, then you know that we kind of talked briefly about the recent tragedy in Hoboken, New Jersey. That kind of inspired this episode idea. And if you didn't listen to last episode, great time to subscribe.
Yeah.
So you should subscribe. Then you can go listen to last episode. You'll be all caught up. But you can just listen to this one. You'll get the picture.
Yes. Hopefully.
Did you have an order for those? Because
Yes.
I didn't. Do you want to start with real world and go to fiction?
Yes.
Or okay, good idea.
Okay. So one of the things we want to talk about here is we're not talking about nearly apocalyptic types of tragedies. We're talking about things that have or could happen and do often happen throughout societies.
And if you want a brief or not so brief on apocalyptic, we have a series
Not so brief.
not so brief because it was supposed to be one episode, became three. So there's a 3-part series we did on apocalypses. We called it apocalypse, the plural of apocalypse. We have an apocalypse series, so you can go back and listen to that. So to do that, subscribe.
Yes, and we will try and be somewhat respectful when we're going over actual real world ones. We'll try not to be joking around as much as typical.
Yeah, and we ask that for your understanding on this because we have no idea if any of our listenership might actually be a part of any of the real world tragedies, and we want to take an objective perspective to these tragedies so that we're not talking. We will talk about some emotional aspects of it, but we want to talk about how it practically affects the world around the tragedy. So we might be in the periphery of the actual occurrence.
And if you are heavily emotionally tied to a tragedy in the real world, maybe this isn't the episode, depending on yourself. You have to know yourself. But some people, if it might cause you pain if you had a deep emotional attachment because of one of these things, you lost someone.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing for us to put this caveat in front of the episode, it's just so that you understand that we are respectful to people's feelings, and we do have a great amount of empathy for anyone who's been through hardship in their lives, and we don't want to step on anybody that way. But we might be talking about this in a way that might bother you. I don't think it will, but
it is going to be objective, and or as objective as possible on our end. So if you are heavily emotionally entrapped into it. And I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way, but like if I lost someone in a big tragedy, it would probably be hard to listen to someone else talk about it objectively.
Yeah, and we're just asking for your understanding, basically. Little benefit of the doubt. Okay.
And one of the things we want to look at here is tragedy is somewhat of a subjective term. Over time in culture, certain things that would be considered tragic will no longer be considered tragic because people become better at controlling them.
Better at controlling
the tragic event.
Yeah. Okay.
So it would lose its impact over time if its damage becomes minimal. Let's say if you have a small famine in a small country 1,000 years ago, that could be tragic because it would be a large percentage of your population that would suffer and possibly die. In a very large country with hundreds of millions of people, several hundred dying would maybe make people sad, but it unfortunately might not be considered as tragic, even though there's the exact same amount of human life. That's just because as there ends up being more people, in general, life cheapens. And I don't mean that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's just sort of a reality, especially in urbanly dense populated areas. human life, and I don't mean for this to sound callous, is somewhat less of value than in somewhere where there are a lot less people. And that's just because you see so much of it. Hearing about a person dying, maybe you saw 100,000 people that day just in transit, going through big stations, going into big malls, and 100,000 is probably a lot for one day anywhere you live. But you see a lot more people, so it has a different meaning to someone who sees a lot less people.
I mean, obviously, just to put a comparison on there, a child losing their parent in a car crash is a tragedy in their life, but that's going to be very different than, say, I mean, we can just easily go into 9/11 where thousands of people died.
Yeah.
So,
and the other thing is too, is some things that would be tragedies today, if you take them back 1,000 years, would be a possibly non-event. For example, if a giant electromagnetic storm hit Earth and wiped out all electricity today, that would be a massive tragedy. 1,000 years ago, it might be these weird lights at night.
Yeah, right.
Which in a strange way would also maybe affect the culture, but in a completely different, non-tragic way.
Yeah. So which one do you want to start on?
Well, you brought it up. We'll go to the big boy on the list.
Might as well go the elephant in the room. So 9/11.
Yeah.
I used to live in New York, and I moved back from New York only 8 months prior to that occurring. So I was actually on a job site when that happened, and my first instinct, having lived in New York and knowing what it was, I felt like someone punched me in the stomach when someone said, "Hey, the Twin Towers got knocked down," because I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's going to be so hard for people to get out of there." Because you've only got so many bridges and so many tunnels, and there's a lot of people in that area in downtown.
Yeah.
And my immediate thought was, could I get down there and help? Like, can I physically get there? And I also, of course, my old roommate, our good friend, Jim, still lived in New York, and there was a chance he might have been in that neighborhood. So we were very concerned that he was all right. And after getting a hold of a few people, they were basically like, you can't get here. They're like, we need help, and there's a lot of people helping, but you don't bother. Like, you can't physically.
Trying to come here will be more dangerous than.
Well, it's not even the danger, just getting back to the practicality. Like, you won't be able to get into the city. I mean, they did shut the city down for part of it, I believe. I believe they closed.
All of the bridges, all of the trains were cut off for at least a couple of days, because I worked at UPS at the time, and from a logistical issue, that was a nightmare logistically.
But that's just it. That's what we're talking about, is the logistics. Like, you think about a building coming down, the first thing we all think about is the human loss and the tragedy of all that. But from a logistical standpoint, New York City is a city that never sleeps. It's always on the go. Even when it slows down at night and you do find streets where there's nobody on them, there's still a lot of stuff going on. So how do you move all that tons and tons of concrete and steel? How do you make sure that all the businesses and the people that live right next to this still function, can still get to even basic things like, when the building came down, it ruined a lot of buildings around it. So, how do they still get basic plumbing? How do they make it to work? How can they clean their clothing? How do they get food?
And what makes it worse too, I think, is maybe, the closer you are to the tragic event, the more likely you are to be connected directly or indirectly to individuals involved.
Right.
And for me, it appears like you were saying, we had a very good friend who lived down in New York. Besides him, I didn't really know a lot of people down there, but still, we're only a couple hours away. It's a place we all go to. Anyone who's ever navigated in Manhattan knows the best way to get around Manhattan is, okay, I know these streets go east and west. Where's the Twin Tower? Oh, there. Okay.
Yeah.
I know how to move now.
Yeah. Like, if you're outside the city and you somehow get disoriented, all you have to do is look towards the city, and as long as you know your east and west and your basic geography, you just look at the skyline.
Which in Manhattan is beautiful because you know east and west perfect,
right?
Or at least city east and west, and you know south because of that. So if you can look down the street, you see the big buildings, and they really stood out down there. Unlike further up by the Empire is too far north, and it's mixed in with a lot of other larger buildings. Those really stood out.
Yeah. So I guess as far as 9/11 goes, like I said, we could do, I mean, look, there's documentaries, there's movies, there's, CNN reports. You can find a lot on it, especially about the personal tragedy.
Yeah.
But from a world builder perspective, if you were to create a tragedy like this, there's a lot of logistics. Like you just said, you worked for UPS at the time. So this is a city that constantly has things moving in and out of the city. I mean, you've got ships, you've got buses, you've got trains, every mode of transportation.
Density, it makes it a very profitable area. So it's one of the things, one of the lures of companies too there is because of the density. For package delivery, it's awesome. It's like, hey, we put a couple of people in a building and they can just don't even need a truck. They just have a box outside they can go pull packages out of and deliver all day. Much easier, much easier than if you go out to the country where there's like, okay, there's a house down the street.
And 4 miles away, there's another business that you have to deliver a box to.
Yeah. Okay.
Kind of got that from here.
So one of the things to think about, and the obvious one I think to go to first from 9/11 is the political ramifications.
Much bigger ripple.
Huge ripple that went throughout because it is what they like to call what they call a grandiose attack. It was very visible. It did take a lot of life, but if you think about it too in perspective of what those buildings held for people, it was a miracle that there was such little life taken.
And
the location of the buildings collapsing, it's a miracle. The number of people that died. I
kind of honestly, when I first heard about it, I would have expected the numbers to be bigger considering, I mean, the building, they were enormous. I mean, you take a look at
I believe 50,000 people is the number of people that worked in, I don't know if it was one of the towers or both towers. I'm not sure, but.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it was over 2,000 people, but not more. How many people died in the building collapsing?
Just short of 4,000.
Just short of 4,000. Yeah. Okay. My numbers were off.
I thought it was, maybe I'm off, but I thought it was like 3,996.
We've got the wealth of the internet. Well, you keep expounding. I'll just look for the number real quick.
The idea is politically, there's a lot of ramifications from this. Like, first off, different than most type of events, you're not going to see the typical instant, in a democracy, you always will have a minority party reaction or the opposing party reaction. And usually they try and instantly jump on to take advantage of tragedies. This one, it was not there for months.
I am going to get another point for remembering my numbers. It was, you just looked it up too?
No.
I thought you just said it was like 4,000.
No, I thought it was 399. I knew it was 996.
It's 2,996. Okay. Yes. That's what I thought. Yeah. But I was a little off. I thought it was just over 2,000. It was just shy 3. Yeah. So. But you said 4.
Well, I said 3,996.
Anyway, I wasn't listening at that point. Anyway, the point here is that while it was a big tragedy, it could have been a lot bigger. And as far as the political ripple goes, you had a country that was absolutely galvanized in its patriotism, but also galvanized in their paranoia about what's next and what's going on. I mean, we live in the United States. We're spoiled by our security and by the safety of our day and our daily routine. We don't live in a country where there are bus bombings all the time, and there's a lot of people that do. There's a lot of people that deal with that kind of everyday life all the time, and we don't. So something like this happening on our homeland was scary, but also unifying,
and especially because the symbolic nature.
Well, right, but I'm leading to the point that allowed our politicians to take advantage, and I'm saying it that way because I don't think it was. I mean, in retrospect, hindsight being 2020, I think it was a little. I don't want to use the word malicious, but
I think it's. I think unintended consequences.
I don't even think it's unintended. I think they wanted to do a given thing, and this allowed them the latitude by the country being supportive of, all of a sudden, very supportive of our military and Homeland Security, and anyway, Homeland Security was not
didn't exist.
It wasn't a household term.
It did not exist.
It didn't exist. They created it. I was going to say, we created Homeland Security because of that, and all of these liberties that the government started taking, we were understanding and to the point of acceptance of a lot of things. And then there was a big backlash off it too. But that allowed our government to then go off to other countries and send troops and deploy people and start killing other people and wage war, even in areas that it had nothing to do with what we were doing. But we as a people were behind it because we were just...
We want to punish someone.
We wanted to lash out.
And
we were angry. It was sad.
And here's one of the things to think about too. One of the great reasons to think of it as a ripple is ripples are waves that are moving away from a center event. And so as things swing one way, they will swing the other way. So much like in the immediate aftermath through about 2003, there was a huge support backing any type of military thought the government had, any type of security thoughts, like the Patriot Act goes through, like or dislike those things, they go through in those periods of time, whether they're unattended or they're a level of control the government wants to wage. That's an arguable point. But there's some truth that it happens there for a reason. And part of it is, one, people are demanding it. It's like, we want security now. And the politicians have one way to show they're doing something, which is to pass laws, whether or not they're effective, whether or not they work.
There's a great concept, and I'm not going to get into it here, but it's a really interesting thing to look up. Take a look at what is known as security theater. Theater. Go to what's the name of the show? Adam Ruins Everything, I think. Pretty sure. Adam Ruins Everything. It's a YouTube
There's definitely
thing.
a show. Well, actually, it's a TV show.
It's a TV show now. It was a YouTube thing for a long time.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Like, I was very aware of that. When I found out he got a television show for it, I was like, oh my gosh, that's awesome. Yeah. But look up Adam Ruins Everything and look up his bits on security theater. It's really interesting stuff. But also Jim Jeffries, who's a stand-up comedian, has a great bit about security theater he does. And like, those are really, the points they make in both of those presentations are really great points about security theater, which is a huge ripple effect of this tragedy.
Because it's not, for the leaders of a country, it's not good enough to deal with a problem. You must make your people feel safe with you as the leader. And that, it doesn't even matter if it's a democracy. If you're a totalitarian government, if there's a tragedy, you must prove to your people that you're in control.
And that you're going to do something.
And that you will do what's right for them or the country or whatever your mantra, however you deliver your speech. And, most security that we're involved with from the TSA, anything is all arguably security theater. It's stuff that we see that make us feel safer, that might or might not have an effect.
Yeah.
Because checkpoints themselves, security checkpoints are meant to stop one thing. So if I set up a security checkpoint to stop someone from bringing bombs on airplanes, I can do that. And it'll be pretty good at doing that thing at best. But the problem is, you can't set up a security checkpoint and stop everything bad. You don't know what it is. You need procedures. You need things for it to be able to work correctly. And the thing is, you can only really secure for something. And even that's not going to be flawless, because it's like, if you get into the mind of someone like me, my job in the service was to break down enemy security. So when I look at things, it's through the lens of, that's easy to penetrate. I could go through there. I could just walk in there. Most security, whether you go into a building, whether you go into an airport, whether you go into a courthouse, is all there for theater. That does not mean there is not real security there, but what you see is there to give people the impression of security. It's like why an armored truck looks so big and imposing. It's so you wouldn't think that it's possible to get in the inside of it. When if they're making a real shipment of money, it's not going to be in one of those trucks because it's really freaking obvious.
Yeah. So what's our next tragedy on the list?
Okay, we're going to another northeastern one here, to Sandy Hook.
Yeah. Well, Jeff and I, before we started the show, discussed a couple. There's been a lot of school shootings in the United States, and they've been very, very publicized between Virginia Tech. Columbine, of course, was probably the first one that really started it, that brought it into the lexicon. But Sandy Hook happened here in Connecticut, only about 40 minutes from where Jeff and I are recording. One of the ways in which I felt a ripple is that I do a lot of work in the New Haven school systems, and I work in a technical profession, and because if I am working in the school systems, I will actually go to like 5, 6, between 3 and 7 schools in a day.
Like you'll hit a whole district.
I'll hit a whole bunch of them. Yeah. The faster I can get in and out of one building and get to the next one, the better off I am.
Yeah.
So it benefits me and my workday to bypass security and get through the building as fast as possible. Now, previously, I could just walk into buildings. It was no big thing. I could just walk in and out as I please. And of course, I've been working in that school system for about 5 years now. So most people that work in the buildings, they know me at least by sight. Not all of them really know me by name, but they're like, oh, that's the guy from that company. So when I walk in, a lot of times they just give me the wave and I just get to go through. After Sandy Hook, all buildings locked down.
Yeah.
Gotta check in, gotta sign in, gotta get a pass, like they either a little lanyard pass or a sticker on my jacket or whatever. It's definitely loosened up now, but for a while there, it would take me, between 5 and 15, 20 minutes just to enter the building, because I had to wait for a given person, get clearance, and then roam around the building, or they had to wait for someone to be available to walk me around the building. It's like, look, I know where I'm going in the basement. My equipment's in the basement. I don't need someone to hold my hand. I'm not here to hurt anyone or blow up the building. Like, I'm just here to service some equipment, But they had their new procedures in place, and they had to follow their procedures.
Yes.
But just like what you're saying about security theater, despite putting those procedures in play, there's still a level of of me, I got to the point like now I can get in and out of the buildings pretty quick again because that security has laxed, and also,
which is usually a consequence of the ripple getting further from the center,
right?
Yep.
And also, I know the buildings and whatever, so I know generally what doors might be unlocked, so I can just enter the building, and then people see me and they're like, "Oh, hey, what's going on?" And I can just get around and do what I got to do. But as far as like how that. See, I was going to say, I was about to break into talking about the emotional aspect of Sandy Hook, and we said we wanted to avoid that. So why don't you take over?
Yeah. So, one of the things to think about, and this is sort of along the same lines too, like the procedures will change. I remember at UPS after 9/11, people who worked at the Bradley Airport facility and at any airport facility couldn't forget their badge. I mean, to the point where you worked there for 20 years. If you came without your badge, you were going to go home and get your badge if you wanted to enter that facility. There used to be rules for who could work out on what you would call the tarmac at an airport, the area where the planes are. Before that, you needed special training to go out there. They didn't want just any person going out interfering with the planes and possibly helping. But there are certain people who maybe didn't do it as often, who might get pulled out on certain things, but post that they needed special additional clearance to go 10 more steps. So they might work inside of a door, but if they stepped outside of the door, they would need an additional clearance, or the company could get in trouble. So, one of the things to remember too with ripples, the closer they are to the impact, the closer the ripples peak and decline, and then they do get weaker as it goes out. But that doesn't mean there's not lingering changes to the society overall. And that's just one of those things where when you're dealing with it in a world building perspective, you have to sort of tie it back and say, hey, what's the ultimate conclusion from this? Which way does it swing? Does it swing to a little bit more pervasive government or a little less pervasive government? And these are the kinds of choices, at least in fiction, that we get to make. In life, life determines that, So let's go quickly and talk about a few more, but not probably as much detail about Hoboken, is one where people might not consider as tragic as definitely these other two. I wouldn't.
No.
Because one, the amount of deaths were a lot smaller. But two, train wrecks do unfortunately happen more often. So we're not as cognizant of the effects.
I don't know how big the story has been worldwide. In the United States, has been big, but there was a big train crash in Hoboken, New Jersey, just a few days ago. So that's what we're talking about.
Or
now.
A few weeks ago, by the time they hear this. But
fair enough. At the point of this recording, it was only a few days
around
ago.
the beginning of October.
Fair enough.
Of 2016.
End of September, actually.
Well, around the beginning of
fair enough. But point being, a train crashed into a station at the end of the line in Hoboken, New Jersey, and more than 100 people were injured, at least one fatality. I believe we're on record now. It's only one fatality.
Last I heard
as well. So when I was watching that morning on CNN, part of me was like, "Oh man, that's terrible," because now a bunch of people got hurt and whatever. But the ripple effect actually came to mind pretty quickly because only one person died, and as the news was coming in,
everything.
The location, yeah, exactly. It's at the end of the line, which means if you live in that neighborhood and that it literally collapsed the roof in a chunk of the station because the train jumped the tracks and took out some girders, and then that dropped the roof down. So if you live in that neighborhood and that is your sole way to get to work, now what do you do the next day?
And in these densely populated areas like in New York City, a lot of times you have your train station.
Yeah. I mean, if you're lucky, you live on a line where, there's a lot of neighborhoods where, you look at a train map, you're close enough, you're walking distance between two stops. You can usually walk, like where I used to live, there was a stop 3-4 blocks away. There was another stop about 10-15 blocks away.
Yeah.
So I could walk to the other. I could walk to the other one, and there were times that I did.
Or I thought it was always interesting too, like this is how segmented life becomes in a mass transit town, though. And this is another maybe interesting takeaway that's less about tragic and more about transportation in these areas. Is our friend who lived there married a woman from, I believe it was technically the same neighborhood in Queens, but the thing was she lived down a different line than him from New York City. So in theory, they happened to meet by happenstance, actually somewhere completely different in a different state, but they really only lived probably in real life terms 30 minutes away, but their lives maybe never would have truly interacted outside of a hub station.
I actually did not know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, she lived like...
Didn't she live in Astoria?
I don't remember.
I want to say. Or no, wait, that might have been where Jim moved to after. Because I did visit that apartment.
Yeah, because it was back where your original apartment was. What was that neighborhood?
Ridgewood.
Ridgewood. I believe it was
worked,
the other side near another line.
Okay.
And that's the reason why, even though they live close there, it's like having a mountain range in between two towns.
Yeah.
Even though, there's no actual mountain range, but most people there, you don't have a car because you're paying more for housing.
Yeah, it's about your transportation systems is a great, just mentioning it that way. While a person might be, as the crow flies, minutes away, if they're not using or remotely going in the same transportation systems, their paths don't cross.
This one really had the chance of becoming what I like to call a silent tragedy, because it's something where you might even hear on the news and think it's bad, but most people aren't going to jump to the conclusion that it's a tragedy. A lot of people were hurt, but only one death. But the actual tragic event, the ripple effects are around just the impact on the transportation in a densely populated area. That in itself can be a tragedy of sorts, even though there isn't the emotional connection that you would definitely have with something like Sandy Hook or 9/11.
Shortly after the CNN started, after a couple hours, you kept getting a little more update on what was occurring on the injuries. But then they had a press conference where basically every person related to smaller New Jersey politics and in New York and New Jersey train transportation systems, the MTA, the PATH, they were all in suits up at the microphone talking about the logistics of what they had to deal with. And obviously they had to be respectful of the personal tragedies that were occurring that day, but they really needed to deal with all the logistics. Like, we still have thousands and thousands and thousands of people and goods to move from point A to point B that this train line took care of. And now we still have those things to move and we have to take care of it. So they're addressing all of these, logical problems, and that's a big ripple.
And one of the impressive things that you see in tragedies, whether they're silent tragedies or grandiose tragedies or really emotionally powerful tragedies like Sandy Hook, is there are still people there that have to do their job.
Yep.
And not only that facility, at the building next door, people who live maybe within several or worked within several blocks of the Twin Towers, maybe some started working within a couple of days, who had buildings or had facilities inside of 9/11, had a temporary emergency building set up, and people were back to work in just a couple of days. And which seems implausible, but one, I'm not going to judge people, because people deal and can work through stuff in different ways, and maybe they needed the distance of work to to not be overwhelmed by the emotion of what occurred to, these people who lost their coworkers, who maybe they're working the outside, taking away rubble, and they lost a family member on the inside. But, that part of life has to keep going on in these things. And even though certain individuals as people, we can sometimes get caught up and overwhelmed, one of the interesting things about society and these tragedies is I've never seen an example where society has collapsed because of a tragedy.
Even when you get a very brief pause, that's really significant.
Yeah.
And the smaller the scale of the tragedy, the smaller the ripple, and subsequently it only ends up getting seen or not seen by a singular person. One that comes to mind, and this is going to be really small scale, so a little personal, not for me, but for someone else. If you've ever seen, and I highly recommend watching, it's excellent, a spoken word performance by Henry Rollins called Talking from the Box, where he talks about his best friend. Like, this guy was like his brother, his roommate. He like just super, super closest friend you could have. And somebody, like jacked them up on the street with a gun and forced them into their apartment and, put them on their knees. And he's like, oh my gosh, this guy, maybe if I can just, offer this guy the VCR or the television or something, he'll leave us alone and he'll leave and whatever. And a very brief altercation inside, one gunshot, and Henry got out, got the police and what have you. But what happened was his best friend, Joe Cole, was shot in the face.
Jesus.
Now, Henry on the video, it's gut-wrenching, the emotional aspect that he talks about.
And one thing Henry Rollins can deliver is emotion in words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he also talks about all of the logistics of it too, which I found fascinating. He talks about how when the police arrived, they have to assume that everybody there is involved somehow, so they arrested him. They put him in cuffs, they threw him in the back of the car, and all he was interested in was making sure his friend got medical attention. And he's like, how is Joe? Is Joe okay? What's going on? And he goes, and the cop was very, oh, he's dead. Just matter of fact about it. Oh, he's dead. And, Henry was, distraught, of course. But the next day, Henry had to go home and clean up the amount of blood that comes out of a 6'4" man who's been shot in the face out of the carpet. And he had to clean up. Like, that is a ripple of a tragedy. Yeah. I mean, you talk about a tragedy in a story, it's real easy to go to Romeo and Juliet and talk about all the emotions and all the hurtness and this family against that family. But I think it's every bit as fascinating to talk about, okay, Henry had to clean the carpet. Yeah. Henry had to eventually, or not, get rid of Joe's stuff. Henry had to get a new roommate. Like, all of these things had to happen for his life to continue, for the logistics of his life. Like, he still had to go to work. He still had to pay his bills. Like, your bills don't stop coming because you lost a loved one. Like, that happens.
No, I think another way to look at it too is sometimes even small tragedies that wouldn't even be picked up by the rest of the world. Let's say, someone getting shot in, a big city, anywhere in the world. The ripples are immediately around the people who know them, but they don't become a societal tragedy like when you have a mass shooting in Orlando or in a school or any of those kind of things. But the thing is, for me, an interesting character development for either a protagonist or an antagonist are their reactions from personal tragedy. And this is going to kind of lead us more into the fictional side of stuff here. But, you think about, one of the most powerful tragedies in comic book history is the death of Bruce Wayne's parents, and in this instance, a hero, depending on who you ask, would rise up to protect Gotham. But it could just be just as easily where you have a storyline with like the Green Lantern where I believe it's like his family's lost or something like that. And it's like one thing too many, it puts him over and he becomes.
Which Lantern are you talking about? John Stewart or?
No. Shoot.
John Stewart, Guy Gardner.
Before.
Hal Jordan.
Hal Jordan.
I thought Hal Jordan was single when he became the Green Lantern.
No, this is not when he became Green Lantern.
Oh.
This is when he became one of the big villains that lasted for generations at Disney. And one too many tragedies happened in his life, and he determined it all needed order to the point where he was willing to do things that he would have never done before and became a horrific villain that all of the other superheroes in the DC universe were trying to band together to figure out a way to stop this exceptionally powerful person at this point. Like he goes back to OA, the planet that gives the power to his ring. He drains the whole battery, destroys them.
Yep, this I know.
I mean, it's just like he creates one of the most powerful villains, or at least the most powerful for a while in DC, based off of tragedy. And so tragedies can have effects through unexpected channels to where one of those ripples starts another ripple. And that's why societies work, is because it's a series of people and the collisions of them make a difference. It's what changes things. It's like, it's not a coincidence that slavery over time becomes outlawed the more educated a population gets, because they start to figure out how screwed up it is and they start demanding that it goes away. If not, there'd be horrible people who would probably still be willing to do it. But today, as a society, we won't allow it, at least legally.
Keeping ourselves on the world builder path, I want to step back to you mentioning Batman a moment ago. Batman is obviously a show favorite, certainly one of he is my all-time favorite
yep.
comic book character. But I think that my view on Batman is a little different than a lot of people's. I think a lot of people who have the generic idea of who Batman is, a lot of people only know Batman from the movies and haven't ever read the books, which, no, let's not, there's a lot of people who have only had a great deal of exposure to the cartoon, which I think was
much better.
Fantastic,
yeah.
But also incomplete.
Yes.
I think, like, my view on Batman is that of a child, a broken man, and an irrevocably changed, a tragedy ripple. So you have this child who suffered the tragedy of watching, not only having his parents die, but watching them die right in front of him.
Yeah.
And later, much later, he decides to dress up like a bat and terrorize the city and beat up criminals. And there's a lot of ways to interpret that. You can say, okay, well, he's just psychologically broken. Well, duh. Like that is not the choice that your average logical man makes. His idea was like, well, I need to they need to be afraid of me, so I need to be scary. But if you
it was very logical in his mind.
It's logical in his mind, but I choose to believe, and there are interpretations that some writers have put out there, that the idea of Batman is the choice made by a child. So a child loses his parents, he could just as easily decide, I'm going to become a police officer because police officers protect people. That's a logical choice. He decides, I'm going to become a ninja and, a combat expert, and I'm never going to use guns, and I'm going to not kill people, and I'm going to dress up like a bat.
Well, and the thing I think where the movies fail to a degree, and I do enjoy the movies, don't get me wrong, is the major obsession of Batman is to find out why. This leads to Batman the detective.
See, I disagree with that.
I agree with that completely because I'm correct.
My thing is, I think his most driving motivator, and certainly in the comics, it's not that I stand for justice. I stand for vengeance. I am going to terrorize the criminals in the night. It's that I am a broken child who lost his parents, and I refuse to let that happen to someone else.
And I think that plays into it, but I think it was his drive to know why put him down the path he was on. The obsession to figure out who killed his parents, why they died. I definitely don't want to take away from what you say, because I actually agree with parts of it, but it's this idea of create the cycle himself to learn more, find more, learn more, and find more. And when you get to the point and figure that out, you're past the point of no return. And that's where it becomes about everyone else. But part of it has to be correct what Mike's saying too, because
Michael,
he chose to go off to ninja land to become a ninja in Tibet or something, I think is the way the current.
Well, I mean, that's what the movie did. I mean, obviously in the comic book it was different. He what?
I'm making stuff up.
I was going to say, I don't think he did that. He did. I seem to remember he hired a lot of experts.
It's one of those things. I think every iteration of Batman, it's different.
Yeah, of course. Of course, everybody has their own Batman. Every generation has their own Batman.
But the detective one is the best.
I like the detective one. I like the detective one, and I am a fan of Bat God, which is the idea that it's like no matter what the obstacle, Batman has thought of it already, and he has a way to prevent or stop the problem, which is fun.
Already in.
It is fun.
Belt.
Yeah. Well, not always already in the utility belt, but it is fun like those. Like read the story Doom, which they also made a movie of. It's really good.
If Batman fights Superman thing and Batman always wins, I'm pretty sure.
Not always, but most of the time. Because if Superman won, he could obviously very easily kill Batman that way. So our big point here is on, when you're writing tragedy, I definitely think it's important because obviously people relating to the story is what makes it compelling. So your emotional investment is important. Like you need to understand the emotional aspects of a tragedy occurring in your stories. Mm-hmm. But I think it would be wrong not to consider all of the logistical aspects of a tragedy too. And I think that when you're reading a story and you have a character suffer a small personal tragedy like this, losing a loved one or losing their entire family or some horrible thing like that, the fact that they still have things to do, that taking them through their routine and still having to deal with the tragedy, I find very interesting because you have an excuse to do something with the character and still talk about their reactions to and their emotional dealings with the tragedy they're dealing with, but they still have to go to work, or at least they have to get back to work soon. They still have to eat, so they still have to go to the grocery store. They still have to go to the checkout person and say, yeah, I have my credit card right here. I'll be paying with it. By the way, I just buried my husband or my wife or my child or my mother a couple hours ago, but I'm out of milk.
And also, don't be afraid to use what you would consider inappropriate reactions to tragedy. The biggest one I think of going back to 9/11 is Gilbert Gottfried's joke that came out way too soon in most people's mind.
Yep.
But understand, different people react to tragedy differently. And I would say Gilbert Gottfried, probably like most people who are professional stand-up comedians, probably react to tragedy through humor. And where it might feel very inappropriate to people who do not deal with it that way, that was probably him as much going through the same process everyone else was. But for him, it needs to come out like a joke because that's how he does it. That's probably why he's a comedian. Mm-hmm. And so don't think that you have to have specific trope responses to input. My parents die and B happens. That's not necessarily the way it's going to be. Where people have the ability to be rational, one of the great things about humanity is our ability to react in random ways that are unpredictable. And as the ripples of an event go through a culture or a community, they will come out differently in different people. And use that in your story to make it compelling, to make the characters compelling. But don't feel pre-locked down because of the way you might react or the way you saw someone else react or the way you think people should or should not react. But no, I think that's pretty good. Do you want to do a world building topic this week?
Task?
Yes.
That's what you meant.
Yes, I said topic, but I didn't mean that.
I would say for a world builder task, if your story does not include a tragedy as a means of exercise, maybe consider a small tragedy, maybe a little side story, short story, fanfic within your fiction of a tragedy. Have your character suffer a tragedy, or just imagine how that character would react. Because I think everyone can empathize, even people who've had pretty rainbow sprinkle lives, has had some form of tragedy touch them. Yeah. So think about, from your personal point of view, like just think about tragedies that have occurred in your life and how they've affected you and what your responses were like, and understand that everyone's been there. Yeah. Everyone's gone through it. Our reactions to it are pretty individual, but it's relatable. So a character that doesn't have that depth probably isn't very realistic.
I think sort of very much along those lines too, you can sit there and say, come up with a tragic event, with the characters and a certain time and place in one of your stories. And just role play out the scenarios in your head, war game it out. What would happen if at this moment, right here at the center of the story, that tragedy was to happen? And then have it a town over and scale it out in different directions. Just see the ripple effects and how they would affect the characters as they cut through the tragedy on the trajectory of their story.
How about a real world task?
Yes. The real world task today is to explore some history.
Anything specific you have in mind?
No, I'm just
You're
reading
just looking at your bookshelf, aren't you?
bookshelf and I think that would be a great thing to do.
Another small real world task: share the show with some friends. And maybe not this one because this one's a little more somber than others. Maybe pick one of our funnier. Start with a funnier one. Yeah, our last one was pretty fun.
Yeah. Last couple have been. I feel like we've hit a groove. Mm-hmm. It only took 50, 100 some odd episodes. Yeah.
75, 75.
It took me like a couple hundred. But
yeah, still getting there.
I'll be funny someday.
Which I think you're funny most of the time.
Yeah. All right. No. So yeah, go ahead and for the actual real world event, why don't you go share it out with someone who might enjoy it? Maybe they're interested in the world side, but they're not necessarily a world builder, or maybe they used to be a world builder and they've sort of, because of their adult life, whatever the heck that means, share a show with them, take a minute or two. And if they don't even understand podcasting and how to get it, show them how to get to iTunes on their iPhone, or show them how to get to Google Play or to Stitcher or something like Podcast Republic, like I use on their Android phones, just to let them get started in this wonderful world of podcasting.
Yeah, and I feel like we've been pushing this button a lot lately, but we're going to continue to, because basically, like, we love what we do, and we're going to keep doing this regardless. Mm-hmm. But it seems a waste if more people aren't listening. I really
and not just for our show, but there's really just so much great content out there.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff.
Good indie stuff, great. Some real great mainstream stuff is amazing.
But forget them. Getting back to our show.
Yeah.
People know about those shows. Please share us with some of your friends. Like, let somebody listen to our show. Encourage them to check us out, the World Builders Anvil.
And now, I'm not saying just pick up their phone when they're not watching and subscribe to our show on their phone.
I am saying that. Feel free to do that to every phone you can get your hands on. I'm all for that. They might discover a nice little surprise and be like, oh, a present.
Wow, this is so much better than everything else I've ever done. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to, and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us in this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram, at gardul.com to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.